Hi folks, I am not doing the intro video this week, but instead here is a bonus video which is about writing the paper for Phil 375. So I've asked you to do either one essay or two shorter essays. All of the rubric, the word counts and specific details about which texts you need to refer to in the essays are on the Canvas page, but in this video I wanted to talk a bit more generally about the task of writing a philosophy essay, and particularly an essay for this course. Those of you who have not written philosophy essays before, if this is your first philosophy class, I do very highly recommend that you start with some of the more introductory materials that are linked from the Canvas page. So there's both written form and also a video, whichever you find easier to follow and digest, but those will just help to give you some of the basics about what a philosophy essay typically is. So yeah, start there if this is your first time around writing philosophy essays. Even if it's not your first time writing philosophy essays, I would actually still suggest you might review them, because it never hurts to be reminded of some of the basic things. Speaking of which, I'm going to start with a couple of the basic things that are really, really important for this essay, or these essays, this essay or pair of essays for this class. So first things first, this being an essay isn't a piece of creative writing as it's typically understood. So you don't have to write beautiful prose, and you don't have to use metaphors. In fact, it's often better to try to be as clear and direct and straight to the point as possible. You want to establish a thesis with your essay, so something your essay says, a conclusion that you try to reach with the essay, and you want to provide some sort of argumentation for the thesis. So those two things are really important. The thesis has got to be there somewhere, and an argument in favor of the thesis. So you're going to have to, obviously it's part of your task to decide what the thesis is. So I've given you questions that you can use as prompts, but what exactly you want to say in response to those questions is up to you to decide. And then how you will build your argumentation depends on, obviously, what your thesis, what your conclusion is. What I recommend, typically for most people, is most effective is to plan before you start writing what you're going to try to say in the essay. So have a sense of, even if it changes along the way, doesn't matter, have a sense of what kind of thesis you want to argue for, and what kinds of arguments you want to bring in. So if, for example, I wanted to argue that Sartre's Nausea is absolute rubbish, terrible piece of philosophy, and terrible piece of literature. Okay, suppose that's my conclusion. You don't have to do that, you can if you want to, but just supposing. Then what I'm going to do in the argumentation part of the essay, which is most of it, is I'm going to try to convince you that nausea is total rubbish. And so I'm going to bring in, probably I'm going to use some quotes from the text, and point out why I think they're rubbish, and maybe I'll say some other things. I might then go on to engage with some of the people who said it's great and prove that that's actually wrong, so dismantle their arguments for the opposite view, and things like that, all in service of convincing you that the conclusion I want to reach is the correct one. Planning your structure is going to be really important for marshalling your arguments to be able to support your thesis. So that's why I suggest for most people planning works well. Even if you don't start with something as explicit as a plan, I would very strongly not recommend just sitting down, writing, and handing in the first draft, because revised drafts, second, third, fourth drafts are going to be much better, almost always. I think always, than that first thing that you sit down and write. When you are revising and you've got a rough draft or outline and you want to make it better, a few of my top tips for doing that are to read it out loud to yourself, have somebody else read it if you possibly can. Someone who has no idea what you're talking about is actually great for this purpose, because they can tell you where you need to explain something better. So someone who already knows what you're saying and understands the texts that you're talking about is actually not as useful to you, because they might not see where there is a gap in the explanation. The other thing I sometimes do is have my dictation software, text to voice, read the essay to me, because then it's easier sometimes to hear where there are awkward phrases or mistakes than it is to see them written down on the page. So that's for proofreading especially, which is sort of the last step before you hand in, just to check for mistakes. Using any kind of text-to-speech software for that can be really, really helpful. Okay, so the other few things I wanted to say that are sort of in this general basics part, clarity is important. So try to be clear, try to write so that it's as easy as possible for your reader to understand what you're saying, both in your conclusion and your argument for the conclusion. Sounding fancy or clever or well-educated is not important. You don't want to sound as if you're trying really hard to sound like you know lots of long words. You want to sound like you know how to make this point clear to someone else. That's not as easy as, it's easier said than done. But it's something that's very useful to strive for, and there's a very specific skill set of writing as clearly as possible that it's just super useful to be able to hone that skill set. So to that end, I absolutely don't suggest bringing in anything that you don't really understand into your essay. You can, of course, you can use other materials besides the ones that are on our reading list if you want to. You may well find it useful to do that, at least to a certain extent, but you don't actually have to. If you can make your case just by citing primary texts, go for it. You don't have to do secondary research for this essay or these essays. Just use what you know and are comfortable using and the text that you're talking about, and that will be your best bet. For these essays, I'm requiring that if you write one, you do address one of the novels. So either Nausea or Iris Murdoch's The Philosopher's Pupil, which is the text we'll be reading right after the reading week. And of course, you can talk about both. You can compare and contrast if you want. And you can talk about other texts that we've also studied if you want. If you do two essays, you have total free choice on the other one. So one of them you have to talk about one of the essays, and the other one, whichever text you want from the course. Yeah, you don't need to do any secondary research. You can add secondary texts if you want to. Quoting. You will probably want to quote at least a little bit from the texts you're talking about so that you can illustrate your points. But try to keep it only where necessary. So an essay, if you hand in an essay that is mostly quoted passages, it's unlikely to be able to demonstrate that you have really understood the text, and you're not going to leave yourself much room to make your own points. So go to quotation when you need to make a point about what this person says explicitly in so many words. And otherwise, just summarize what's in the text. Use your own words. Just get it. You can be much quicker and more efficient that way. And you also convey that you know what's going on better if you can summarize and use your own words to explain what's in the text. When it comes to citation practice, I don't demand that you use a particular style for citations, but what is required is that you have to have a consistent style, and it has to be one of the standard ones. So for those of you who are familiar with MLA citation styles, that's fine. If you're familiar with APA citation styles, that's fine. If you're familiar with a citation style from another course that you've been taught, it's probably one of those or something very similar. It's probably fine. If you do have any questions about citation, please feel free to ask Jelena, the TA, or myself. We should be able to answer those for you. just make sure it's consistent and that it has the adequate scholarly information for people to follow up your citations. So yes, and please do also cite the course text that you're talking about. So if you're writing an essay about Sartre's nausea, cite Sartre's nausea. I know that it's the one we've studied, but it will be important to specify what translation you're using. And this goes for any translated work, actually. It's always important to cite the translator and the date, obviously, of the translation, because it does matter. That does, I think I've said earlier in one of my previous videos, a translation is a significant practice of its own. And so which translation you're using will impact what kind of text you're dealing with. So make sure when you cite the specific translation that you're talking about. Also, it will affect things like page numbers if people want to follow up on your citations. Good. Do I need to mention anything else? I think those were the main things that I wanted to cover. The other few things that I might recommend are to try not to start the process of planning your essay with a preconceived idea about what kind of thing you can do. And it sounds a bit vague and woolly, but I'm trying to encourage you to think a bit originally about this part of the process. And so the reason I picked the example of arguing that Sartre is rubbish is just to encourage you to realize that you don't have to say Sartre is great or that Iris Murdoch is great. You can say what you think they do really badly if you want, and that's a completely legitimate kind of analysis, a completely legitimate kind of essay in this course, in this context. You can also you can pick apart the questions themselves using the texts to sort of illustrate what's wrong with the questions if you want to. That's totally fine to do as long as you are still using the texts from this course to make your point. That's the only requirement, really. Beyond that, what you want to say in response to the prompts, that's entirely up to you. And as I said, how you want to structure your arguments is also entirely up to you. The only thing I would say is make sure there is a structure, because one thing that's very clear when we are reading and grading essays is who has a structure and who doesn't. It's not really something that you can fudge or pretend to have. It's pretty obvious. It's sort of like the difference between looking at a work of art with all the pieces in the right place and looking like a big splodge of muddy paint on a canvas that's just sort of smeared in there. It's pretty clear what the difference is. And if you want to perform this particular task well, which is this academic paper, this philosophy essay, then you need to do the first thing, the structured thing, with things in their place in order to build your case and convince readers of your conclusion. So yes, make sure you have one of those as well. Make sure you have a conclusion, you have some arguments for your conclusion. And if you have both of those things and you're writing really clearly and you're not trying to sound fancy, but you're trying to sound as clear as possible and get your point across, and you're only using things that you know, but you are using things from this course, including at least one novel, if you do all of that, you'll be fine. So there we go. You don't need to know lots and lots of other philosophy outside of what we've talked about. If you do, that's great, but you really don't need to. A really close read of the texts that we are studying will see you right. Okay, if you have any further questions, like I said, do get in touch with Yelena or myself, and we'll be happy to help you out. And next week is reading week, of course, so you won't see any of us for that week. And then after that, we'll be back for Iris Murdoch, The Philosopher's Pupil. I hope everyone's enjoying Nausea. I'll be on the forums this week instead of Kristen, because she's doing the intro videos, which are up before this one, so you should be able to see them now as well. And she'll be back on Friday with the wrap-up, and I will see you again after reading break. So I hope you have a good week, and I hope you have a good and refreshing reading break, and stay safe.